This episode of the Small Town Companion podcast is brought to you by State Farm Insurance. Jennifer Warren Agency is a local State Farm agency offering a full line of insurance products, including auto, homeowners, renters, life, business, and recreational vehicles. For the past 20 years, Jennifer and her team have been servicing Western New York customers from Boston, New York, and beyond. The New Boston Hotel. The New Boston Hotel is a regional tradition in the South Towns with a full-stocked bar and restaurant with a friendly staff focusing on great quality food. Come on in for their famous prime rib, lobster dinners, wings, clams, amazing sandwiches, real-cut French fries, and more. Three Girls Cafe. Family-owned and operated and open for breakfast, brunch, and lunch, Three Girls Cafe is a favorite in the area and has been serving the Boston and South Towns region their wonderful home-cooked food for over 20 years. Boston Country Styles. Boston Country Styles is the place in Boston for women, men's, and kids' cuts, styles, coloring, foils, wraps, and perms. Also offering wash and set and keratin treatments too. My guest today is a historian for the town of Boston. I asked Frank to come on to the podcast as I think Boston is a bit of a mystery to many Western New Yorkers, along with Springville, Marilla, Colden, and a few others down in this area. If you don't live there or have friends or family there, you probably rarely have ventured into the town. Well, okay, maybe you've stopped off for gas off the 219 on your way to parts south, but next time you do, try taking the 277 down through the entirety of the town, all the way through to Springville for a real treat, especially in fall. I promise you won't be disappointed. From my very first drive through the town and the hills and valleys there, I got a dead-on Vermont vibe that continually surprised me around every corner. Frank really helped clarify the town's history a bit and offered some great anecdotes throughout our conversation and perfectly illustrated just how much history the town has. Boston offers some truly unique Western New York businesses and experiences, and I highly recommend taking a short drive to the town when you get the chance. So, have you lived in Boston your whole life, or?
So 30 years.
Oh, well, yeah, you're a lifer, kind of.
Well, yeah, half my life, let's put it that way.
Yeah, how did you end up there?
Well, it's kind of a unique story. I mean, I grew up on the west side of Buffalo and remember many times as a child coming down to the Boston Hills, Boston Valley. My father had a brother-in-law and obviously sister who lived down here. So we would come out to Uncle Jake's farm and shoot the 22 and,
wow,
just some fond memories growing up.
Right.
Well, I left the area. They passed on when I was a teenager, my parents did, and left for California for 11 years. Came back here to Western New York, spent about a year up toward the Buffalo area and just hunting for a home, and decided on a nice 3-acre parcel of land down here in North Boston, and have enjoyed it ever since.
Oh, so I was in California for 11 years as well. That's crazy.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Where were you?
So San Diego County, up in Escondido. I don't know if you know down in that area.
Yeah, very familiar with all of that, actually. I pretty much traveled everywhere in California for 11 years. It was part of my, a little bit part of my job to see the north, everything from basically Monterey up to Oregon. But I was down south a lot. So, yeah, I'm very familiar with that area, yeah.
So, yeah, 11 years out there, 10 in Escondido, a year up in Temecula, Marilla, Hot Springs area.
Wow, that's awesome. So did you go through what I think everybody goes through? You went through a period of acclimation where you're like, wow, this is awesome. And you tip on out the door in flip-flops and a nice shirt every day. And then after 3 or 4 years, you're like, man, this is like Groundhog Day. It never rains. There's no fall. There's no Christmas,
Yeah, no, it took a little getting used to. I guess you call it the thinning of the blood, and enjoyed that. But as far as seasons go, I was in Escondido, was 30 minutes from the beach and 30 miles from the mountains, and spent a few times up in the mountains and in the snow and had some fun up there. And
were you like Big Bear area or up?
Yeah, Big Bear was one of the vacation spots we'd go up to. Julian, I'm not sure if you know where that is.
Yeah, I know where that is.
Mining encampment up that area, and just had
Yeah,
wanted to.
That's a sweet spot, right there, because you can do that. And I think a lot of people say they think that you're giving a lip service, but that's not true at all. You can literally go up and go skiing and come down and go to the beach.
Very true. Yeah.
So it's pretty cool. So you came back and you guys settled on a nice piece of property there in North Boston, you said?
So yeah, it's actually Hamburg zip code, the way they have it figured out. But I'm about a mile or so from the post office in North Boston here. So really, it is North Boston,
Right.
walking distance to the old Boston Valley School.
And so you've been in Boston too. So when I was a kid, one of my dad's best friends lived out there, and I did the same thing. We would go out there, we would ride ATVs, we would shoot guns, we would just have I was a young boy, so that was like a wonderland for me out there. And it really wasn't developed at all when I was a kid. As far as I remember, I don't think there was really anything there. And now it's really kind of come into its own. There was, of course, the older Boston area. But as far as like up near the thruway, I don't remember any of that being there. Is that correct?
That's correct. Once the 219 came in the 70s, that kind of brought some new life to the North Boston area. And really the way the town kind of refers to that as kind of the business district, if you will. So it is a lot more commercial. You've got your CVS's, you've got your Tim Hortons and whatnot. And then, as you get into what used to be called Boston Center, which is Patchen today, you've got a couple of established businesses that have been there, and some old buildings as well. And then you move a little further south, you get into the actual Boston Corners. And, it's interesting to look at old photographs of that Boston Corners area and seeing the old Boston Hotel, the Iroquois Hotel that was there back at the turn of the last century.
Right.
And, all the prosperity that was going on at that time. And then, as you go down there, I've often told the town supervisor, so wouldn't it be neat if they could just build up that corner again, just in some fashion?
Yeah, there was a town, and to speak directly to that, so so I lived in Sonoma and Woodland, and I ended my tenure in California in Sonoma, and we would travel up 12 all the time. And I don't know if you've been up there, but there's a town after Healdsburg that's called Windsor. And so the quick story of this is that there was a group of investors that basically took the town back to its original look. And if you go there, it's beautiful. They kind of Main Streeted Disney-esque, the town really, but It's awesome. There's a lot of live, work, use space. They put all the old architecture back. I as far as I remember, people telling me the town was in disarray pretty much, like all small towns really, if they go through a rough patch. And these guys just got some investment money, and the town's beautiful. It's got a beautiful town square, all the buildings that, because it was a rail stop at one point. So it was a typical square. The train would pull in, you'd get the commerce, and you'd get the patrons based on the rail line. And I kind of see that throughout Western New York. Like, the good thing about Boston is that the bones of that area are still there with that, where you have the new Boston Hotel and the deli and the little salon there, and then the Veterans little square park there. At least that's there. But I would think that since the original Boston Hotel meant so much to so many people, it would be awesome if somebody could actually put that back, and put that right. Because I think when that burned, that took a lot of, it took a lot of memories, it took a lot of history away. Is that correct? I mean, is that how the town feels?
Well, it's kind of twofold, right? So because back in the day, there was the old Boston Hotel, and then that had burned down. And then what we all fondly remember going down was the brick Boston Hotel that was on that corner, the same corner that the original was. And then when that burned down about 10, 15 years ago, that did impact the community there. And it was nice to see the new Boston Hotel restaurant open up across the way. And obviously the food is amazing as always.
Yeah, she did a great job with that. And I went in there to take pictures for their account because they took an account, and they fed me. I was not expecting anything. I just thought I'd be there for 10 minutes taking some pictures, and they fed me a beautiful meal. It was delicious. It was top end, quality. So yeah, and a lot of people I've heard my time through Boston, they're just glad that she, had the impetus to actually get there to that spot and just at least have that now, because if it was gone, that would have really left a hole there in the community. So now you just brought something to my attention that I was unaware of. So it burned twice. The Boston Hotel, the original burned, and then they rebuilt, and then that one burned. I actually thought that the one that I knew was the one that was the original. I didn't realize there was one prior to that.
Yeah, there was, and actually 2 hotels right next to each other in those days. Again, we're talking late 1800s, early 1900s, right? And I mean, Boston had the railroad going through from Buffalo, Susquehanna Railroad, and it was just a booming area at that time, and people had to stay places. There was actually one up the hill too that nobody knows about because it's long gone. Mm-hmm. That was right across the street from the train depot in Boston, and that was pretty interesting just to see that. And there are remnants up there. Today you can't really travel up there because there are power lines going through. But if you drive down the valley and you kind of take a look off to the side and you see the power lines, that's the route that the tracks were on for quite a few years.
I play this little game with myself now because I'm traveling all over Western New York, and I've been doing this for a while now. I moved back in 2014, so I did a children's show for a while, and then it transitioned into this travel show. So at this point, you develop eyes for these things, and there was just one that I found last week, and what I'm alluding to, I think it's on 77. So there's these areas where you'll enter what was like a little hamlet, let's say, right? And you could recognize a building that had to be a tavern hotel. And then you can if you look past the architecture, you can kind of see what was there at one point. And if you look around even further, you can see, oh, that must have been like a blacksmith shop. Oh, that was the tavern. That was the hotel. And then my very next thing is, where's the rail line, right? Where's and then inevitably, just like you said, there's a rail line, and sometimes it's not even in use anymore. You can see where the rail line was, and this just happened. I was coming home from Medina, and I forget the junction that I was on, and I turned left. And I was like, holy cow, this looks exactly like it was a little train stop at one point, and had all the architecture, but it had been developed into kind of shabby apartments and whatnot. But I love doing that. And, there's so many little towns around Western New York that at one point, because of the rail lines, and they were stop-offs to somewhere else, or they had their own little industry there. And the difference between sometimes I think Western New York and New England, I lived in New England for 4 years, and this is just to give a counterpoint. So New England, for some reason, and I don't know why this is, and I wasn't there long enough to find out, but they really seemed, for the most part, a lot of those towns retained those things. And in Western New York, we're kind of split on it. Some towns lost it, and completely lost it, and you'd have to do what I do. You play that game, and you look, and you can see it. And other towns kind of upheld it to some degree. So, and Boston played, a pivotal role, right, in that area. Is that correct? It seems like as the development of the Southern Tier went along, Boston did play an important role in that development. Correct.
Absolutely. A lot of folks from the Buffalo City area would come down on vacations. It was, kind of a wonderland down here, right? There was folks can look that up. It was the Anthony Homestead, and they had 100 acres down here right next to the 18-Mile Creek.
Right.
And it was kind of like what you'd call a modern day bed and breakfast back then. And they allowed camping outside, pitching tents. And again, we're talking, late 1800s, early 1900s. It really thrived during the war years. And, back to the railroad there, a lot of folks that go to George's restaurant don't realize the North Boston railroad portion of that came right in the backyard of George's hot dogs.
Oh, you're kidding.
With a little depot across the street. And again, as you're following the power line, so to say. And then a lot of folks don't know that those tracks were dug up after the trains went down in 1916. They dug those up, sold them for scrap. They were on their way to France, and German boat sunk it in the Atlantic by a German submarine.
Oh,
so all
wow.
that is sitting down at the bottom of the Atlantic somewhere.
The whole track, right? The whole line.
Yeah, the whole line.
So what was North Boston so there was a stop must have been down near the old hotel, correct? And then there was one up north, is that correct? Up near George?
Yeah, there was actually 3 in all. There was one in Patchen, little depot there,
okay.
little stop, so to say. And then as you move north, you hit up the North Boston one, and then you'll make your way on in toward Hamburg. Obviously, the fairgrounds were around, right? They've been around many, many years.
Okay.
they would make a stop there, of course, and then on their way into Hamburg and then on up to Buffalo.
So this is really interesting to me because this really explains Boston then to a degree, because I try to seek out like the core, right? And to be quite honest with you, I know that we went through it. I know we went through the old Boston Hotel area because I vaguely remember that, but I don't remember it in a very vivid way. And so I did rediscover it when I came through there on my way to Springville. And it's funny because I was mentioning to people over the last 2 years, just off the, just in conversation, there's some towns where you're like, where's the town? And Boston was one of those towns. In my back of my head, I was like, there's got to be like something there that caused all this development. And when I went down to Springville my first day, I take back roads, and lo and behold, I came across the spot with the new Boston Hotel and the deli, and there it was. And so, but my issue was, well, how did Boston get this string approach to the development of their town? So that's really what enabled that development, because you had these 3 stops, essentially, correct? So everywhere there was a stop, there's a little bit of development built around that stop, correct?
That's correct. There was up the hill there, and then as you progress down the hill, then you got to the square and the real town, if you will, from that aspect, from a Boston standpoint. Absolutely.
But that was probably a rarity in those days, because most towns probably only had like one primary stop, correct?
Yeah, they usually did. And if you look at a map, even in today's map of the county of Erie, you've got this big square right in the center of the county of Erie, and it's Boston. And you come down the 219, you see now entering Boston, and really, it's kind of unique from that aspect. And before you know it, you're down in Concord, and that's pretty much on its own as well.
Yeah.
Down in that area. But at the end of the day, the uniqueness, it really did start not only with the farmers, obviously, and the tradesmen. They needed a way to get up to Buffalo, right? So they built those roads, and even from the Springville, farming communities down there, they had to get up, toward the north as well to get their goods to market, so to say. And it really turned things around. Boston's got a lot of uniqueness to it too. A lot of folks don't realize they had a small care of an oil industry, so to say.
I think you mentioned that actually in your email, and I never knew that. Some old
photos still exist up on the hill there by the old St. John's Cemetery, and it's pretty unique. I've put a few items out on a social media site that I've maintained long before being the town historian down here, and it's amazing how many folks that live in the community never realize some of the little nuances in history behind it. And that's what's exciting for me when I started doing that, was the past and the present. Let's bring some of that past to modern day and kind of show folks, hey, Boston's a lot more than what it is today from days gone by, and we have so much potential for the future as well.
Yeah, that's exactly why I do this show. It's in a nutshell, you just hit it right on the nose, because that's the point of this, is that you don't, it's like that here in West Seneca for me. And my first episode this year is about Ebenezer. And, I lived here my whole life, and quite honestly, and I went to this, I spent a lot of time in the hamlet of Ebenezer per se, and I knew nothing about it until I moved back home after, 15 years gone actually. So I was completely unaware, and I'm sure 90% of the people that live here are unaware. Now, if they're not interested, that's all well and fine, but I think there is something to be said for, the fact that you live in an area. You always have a partial interest in, you're biased, right? You live in here. So why not learn a little bit more about it? And why not understand where you live a little bit better? And a lot of people honestly really enjoy this type of thing. I just think they're not, they have to dig a little bit, and the world's a very noisy place. So you have to kind of present it to them in a nice way. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do here. And in Boston's the same way. Like, I'm sure I knew about 3 different families that live there, and I can guarantee they didn't know much about any of this. And it's a very interesting place, and it holds, I think, a special place in Western New York history because of its proximity and because of what it meant. It was kind of like a doorway, right? It was like a gateway.
Absolutely. And some of the the citizens that lived here. They were unique in themselves in those days, and I'm talking 120, 150 years ago.
Sure.
This past March, I saw an old newspaper clipping. As historians like to be curious, right? They like to do research. They like to figure out and find out and look deeper into things there. And it was Women's History Month. And we had a citizen here back in the early 1900s, and her name was Susan E. Hoff, and just amazing woman. Once I looked into her past and into her history and the things that she brought forth, she was one of the first women to vote in Boston after women's suffrage was enacted in 1920.
Wow.
To give you an example, she was one of the first automobile drivers of the female side of things, right? Wow. So it was kind of interesting for that to happen. She was the first one postmaster in Boston. She opened up a coffee shop. She was an entrepreneur, and a lot of that took place right in that Boston Common Center of Boston that you just alluded to.
And so she was a trailblazer, right?
She really was.
But when you think about it, so who would go and these pioneers, because you had to have you were an entrepreneur by your nature if you did that, right? Because you were seeking a better life. You knew that you were a lot of people came out to start their own business or to be involved in a new industry, so there was a lot of that industrious entrepreneurial mindset going on at that time. So it just drew people right to it because it was a new frontier. I mean, we were west. One I think I did the Holland Land Office on my other show, and we were talking about to the curator of the museum, and it was funny because I know it, but I don't think about it. But he was like, "This was west." This was the West here where we are because there wasn't anything after us. So, these people, these were the adventurous spirits. These were the entrepreneurs of the day. These were the computer guys that were standing on the edge of technology and business and looking into the future and saying, wow, there's just an amazing opportunity here. And it drew people like her, I'm sure, right, by the bucketful, really. And that's where
And Tony, the uniqueness of Susan is she married a young businessman as well. Perry Harvey Dye was his last name. You might recognize that. There's A.W. Dye Insurance down here in Boston in an old historic building, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, I've passed it. Sure.
Right. And, that was her son. And, that business is carried on and named down here. And, they contribute very much to the community. Heck, my middle daughter used to play soccer and represented A.W. Dye as they do sponsorships down here, and was very happy to do that in the old house leagues that they had down here. That's
so cool, actually. So now, when Boston, what was the first spark? Like, what ignited Boston? Did the rail line and a stop come first, or was there, because the Holland Land Office, obviously people were buying plots of land. So there were people, basically farmers were buying the land, and then you had a group, let's say, of farmers. They needed the transportation. They needed to get their goods to market. They needed to get into Buffalo, and then they put a train stop in, or so what came first here?
Well, obviously the settlers came down, right? And from that aspect of it, it was a lot of the Germans, a lot of the Polish came down here. And, that's where everything started to root up. Well, they needed churches from then, right? So we had a lot of churches, from the first ones from around 1811, before we were a town. There was the Free Will Baptist Church that started up. And then obviously you had the War of 1812. That had a few things. People wanted to get out of that upper town area, so to say. In 1817, the town of Boston was formed, kind of an offshoot, if you will, from the town of Eden, really dividing from Eden there. But again, farmers, you had all types of industry in that day, if you will, tanners. You had the sawmills was real big. You had the creek here, and if you look at some old maps of Boston from the 1860s and 1880s, you could see the sawmills and the grist mills. And it was really interesting from that aspect of things. Then, of course, other things came in from there. You had to have normal businesses, if you will, and all the way up to the bell factories for cowbell. There was one of the largest was there, and then it moved into another location, which is behind one of the churches here in Boston. Obviously, long since long since gone to the sands of history, if you will.
And so basically, once the rail lines came in, that like anywhere else, I mean, that was the modern day throughway. So once
the roads, then the trains, and then obviously the 219, right? So, but the railway did bring it up. A lot of the city folks coming down again, vacationing, and then the population really started to explode once obviously the advent of the car,
right,
the highways, and people started going out for those Sunday drives, as we talked about earlier, as I was a kid back in the 60s coming down.
Sure.
From that aspect of it.
Well, it is. And I still think to a degree it is a destination. And it's funny how these things kind of get passed along, because since I've even been home, a couple of my friends would literally say, we're going to go, I'd be talking, what are you going to do this week? And we're going to go take a ride down to Boston. And that's a very Western New York thing to say, and I never heard it anywhere else. Like, I would do that in California all the time. I'd go for a ride just to go for a ride somewhere, but nobody would really use that term in that way. But Boston seems to still, and it might have been one of those things that's just a subversive thing that's just been passed down, that it was this destination like that for a long time, but I hear it often. I'm going to take a ride down to Boston. I'm going to take a ride down to Boston.
And you think about that, in once you get into September, October timeframe, the leaves are changing.
Sure.
Hey, let's go down and ride through the Boston Valley. Right? They get off on the 391, and they take the 391 Boston State Road, if you will, all the way down to Springville, and just enjoy the countryside and a few unique stops on the way. A lot of little businesses there, some that have been around since I was little.
Right. And well, that's a thing too. So now you live there, so and I've just been recently exposed to Boston myself. So again, I would go there. We went there probably once every 3 or 4 months when I was a kid for a decade or more. But he lived, I think, out near the 219 a little bit, probably up in North Boston. I really don't know where he lived, but it wasn't down near the Commons at all. So when I was traveling down to Springville, I was amazed at that valley, because it reminds me of Vermont and New Hampshire and New England. And that's something that I really want to impart when I do this episode, because it's so vitally important to really expose the geography there, that we have that here. And I think a lot of people now, granted, if you're one of the people that says, I'm going to go take a ride to Boston, that for, but if you don't, you should, because it's identical. The geographic way that the earth kind of rolls over itself, you know what I mean? It's got that beautiful, well-loved hewn to it, that whole area down there, and it's got to be spectacular. I haven't seen it in fall, so I'm really looking forward to checking it out and seeing it. But it's just one of the aspects of that area that I think probably throughout the course of time continues to draw people and drew people all the way back.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, all 4 seasons are beautiful. The winter, obviously, right? If you're prepared right after a nice little snowfall and just seeing the snow on the limbs of the trees, I mean, it's just gorgeous. Going through the community down here, and then you get into the summer and it's just so green and lush. It's just amazing from that aspect.
And speaking to that, so recreation, so like you were saying, so people would come down there and they would come to this, what would you call that? Like you said, it was kind of like a B&B, but what was a term that they used then for Anthony? What was it, the farm that you were telling me about?
So it was called the Anthony Homestead.
Anthony Homestead, okay.
Yeah, and really it was the way they put it in one of their flyers. I actually have a copy of that flyer from back in the 19-teens, if you will, about 1917. It's called the Ideal Vacation Spot, open to summer boarders from June 15th to October 1st. So they gives you that, that summer span of time, and then right before the leaves really do change and stuff like that.
Right.
And just a unique area down here that they would invite people to come down, a 100-acre farm, and just enjoy camping, and just enjoy they had large rooms. Obviously, the building's still there. Folks can go by it's obviously someone's home today, but
so
you can just imagine what it looked like 120 years ago. At 100 acres of land.
Yeah, I think Jennifer from State Farm and I were talking about this, and she brought it to my attention. Isn't it? It's across from her shop, correct?
Exactly.
And it's got a historical plaque in front of the building. Is that correct?
It does not yet, and I am actually working on a few areas down here that I feel deserve a historical plaque, and that is one of them.
Oh, that's funny. I thought there was one there, but
Yeah,
yeah. So,
there is one right there about the first settlers. The first,
oh, that's what it was.
Are right there. Yeah.
But Jenna, yeah, she brought it to my attention because she told me the whole. She told me that she said, "Oh, that house over there, it has this beautiful history, and it was." Of note for everybody in the region. So it's great that it's still there, though. I mean, that's just an awesome thing. Although I'm sure the land is quite smaller now.
Right.
So, what was the first big industry in Boston outside of farming? Like, what really, okay, so we had the recreation, we had the farmers, and we've got a train line. But what was the thing that really, was there something specifically that ignited the area?
Well, a few things that they had going on down here. So there was the Boston Creamery was down here, and that was in the early 1900s as well, was the Boston Creamery Association. And that was on Boston Colden Road, just off the old Route 19.
Okay.
219. And many farmers would bring their milk in there, right? And that was an interesting time, so to say, because there was a lot going on in the community there as well with regards to other aspects of it. So we talked about blacksmiths and the tannery. It was there. A lot of the grain. Obviously, farming was the biggest industry. Some cattle as well down in the area, whether it was sheep for wool, obviously cows and whatnot. From the other side of that, goats and the list goes on. As I investigated, or the curious mind wants to know, hey, how did some of the names of these roads come about? And you look back in history on some of the unique names like Omphalius down here, and you realize that was the last name of a farmer, and they had a big homestead up on the hill, obviously right, connected to Omphalius Road. And then you just you dig into that history, and where was that land, how big was that land, and you look at old census records and kind of gauge what they had and did. But a lot of the old censuses, and I'm actually digitizing some of the old records that the town hall has from the 1870s and 1880s, and just looking at their farm hands, their housewives, if you will, their farmers, and then you've got the other ones that are calling out blacksmiths and whatnot. So really, heavily rural from that side of the
right,
coin there, not the industry. And then the businesses, right? They had businesses that had to sell equipment and whatnot from that.
Well, it's and as the development of Western New York kind of proceeded to move west and south, so these suppliers and these businesses were kind of aggregating from this point, correct? Like Boston kind of became, and Springville too, correct? Concord and Springville, those right, that whole little trifecta of the village and the township of Concord, and then Boston and the Commons area, that was kind of like your engine for that development.
And if you look at some of the old maps, and I've been fortunate enough to discover some old photos and old what they call RPPC, real photo postcards that were done by a gentleman that actually lived in the community down here. So back in the 1800s and early 1900s, there's an old business that was owned by Mark Whiting, and down in Boston, and today it's a vacant lot, but the photos kind of show the history behind it. Mm-hmm. But again, this is one of those townspeople that was another enterprising citizen, and he did a lot of things, from being a business owner and entrepreneur all the way to the postmaster, school teacher, was a sportsman, and even a politician, undertaker. We've still got a building down here nowadays. It's a veterinarian, but that was actually the undertaker, if you will, for many of the funerals back at the turn of the last century.
Right.
Back in those days.
Oh, that's right after the empty lot where the old Boston Hotel was, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep, right before you get to the Historical Society.
Well, and the Commons being what they are, I mean, I was just thrilled when I found it, and I'm sure I think it was his name Jerry, who runs a deli. Mm-hmm. He was kind of laughing at me because I was, That's, for me, that's a prize to find, because I had, for years, I'm like, I swore there was like an older township in Boston, right? And I remember even telling my mom bought her car at the Chevy dealer there. And when I was driving her there, I was complaining the whole ride when we got off the 219. I was like, I've been doing this travel show for years. And I was like, where's this town? There's no town here. I said, there's got to be a town here. And then, she's like, I don't know, because when we used to go up to your dad's friends, it was just, we never got to that. And I was like, there has to be. I remember something like that. So when I first found it that day, I was thrilled. I stopped, I parked the car, I got out, I talked to Kathy, I talked to Lisa, I talked to Jerry, and I think they were just like, who is this guy? He's so happy to be here. But I think you can see it. And, it's still there. And that's really important. It's vitally important, because a lot of towns have lost that,
No, they have. And it's funny you mentioned the car dealership, right? So back in 1938, if you will, the dealership actually opened up on Trevette Road down here.
Okay.
And eventually moved over to become a Chevrolet dealer, and I believe during the war years, like 1944. And then in 1972, they opened up Emmerling Chevrolet back in those days. Today it's Capolino. Mm-hmm. But I thought that was the neatest thing, seeing a car dealer down there. Now they're heavily got a heavy presence down in Springville today. But right. Maurice Emmerling was really, if you will, the founder, if you will, of Boston Valley Sales back in the farming equipment days, and that was his big gig then. But tractors and whatnot, and then got into Chevy trucks and cars in the war years.
Oh, that's interesting, actually. So is there any remnants of any of the initial train depots? Are they all gone?
So there is one, and if you're fortunate enough to kind of have that eye, as you mentioned earlier, as you drive up toward where the those power lines are, if you will, that would be the train tracks going across the road. Just before you get to that, probably about 3 or 4 houses before then, heading up the hill.
Okay.
It was moved down the hill, the depot, and today is a family residence.
Ah, okay. So the building's actually still there then. It's just over time. Well, that's
not in the same spot. And,
sure.
All modernized, if you will.
Right. Well, that's great, though. I mean, and that's a shame. Like, I went to Europe in 2000, and to see, like, how that infrastructure never went away, for the most part. And now I think it's such a shame, right? Because, I mean, you as a historian, that's your bias. And I'm sure you wish the same thing. Like, you just wish at least we had one in every few towns. They were still connected, and we could still use them, and we could still utilize, the trains for, not only goods and commerce, but for actually the public, right? Because there's no better way to travel, if you ask me.
Absolutely. In the area, I always have fond memories of the Attica and Arcade Railroad growing up as a kid. And wouldn't that be neat if there was one from Springville to Hamburg, that could do something similar to that?
Right.
Obviously, Hamburg has one that goes down through the southern tier during the fall time for the leaves.
Yep.
But very unique. And there are still other remnants of those. They put a lot of work into getting that train going through the valley, and a lot of remnants on private property, and then also some that you can see from the road from the old 219 as well.
So now is Boston, because over the last, let's say, like 20 years, I mean, it's starting to be more developed. Are they cautious about overdeveloping North Boston? Or do you know, like, anything about, because one of the beautiful aspects about that area is just the geography and the nature that's there, right?
Right.
You don't want to.
Well, Tony, what I would tell you is, as I mentioned earlier, North Boston is going to be your more commercialized area. In some conversations I've had with the town supervisor, that it's that rural community of Boston. They want to keep it country.
That's great.
They don't want to exploit it. And there's been some folk that have looked into businesses, if you will.
Sure. There always is.
It's one of those things where and I give some of our other communities around credit for maintaining that line as well, and keeping it where there is that getaway from the hubbub of today's world, right? Especially in technology and everything that's going on today at a rapid pace. It's just good to just get away and take that country ride, or if you do, and I get out every day with my little dog, and take that mile and a half hike around, and we've done a few other pretty good ones, 6-mile jaunts into the valley along the creek, and just enjoy that.
Well, that's the thing. You don't want to lose any of that.
No.
I mean, that's what the place has such a great feel to it, and it just has a vibe that you just don't want to hurt. And granted, you're always going to have to, you need taxes, right? And everything gets more exponentially expensive, of course, and you need development. But, Boston should always retain that sense of place. And a lot of places over time, if they get too developed, they lose that. So, and I think that there's just smart growth and, well-managed growth in that area would just retain that, because people move there because it's such a beautiful place, and the last thing you want to do is disturb that, that sense of nature and the sense of place that it has. Even up towards, the 219, you still know where you are, and it still has that sense of place and township. So as time progressed, the commons gave way to the Norse development, and now it seems that the south, I guess we could say the south end where the commons are, is that kind of the thing where there's a lot of old Bostonians there, and then you get this new, is there like because to me it's like there's new Boston and old Boston. Is that correct? I mean, there's just like this sensibility. When I go down and I talk to people down towards the commons, you do get a lot of this retrospective sense. Do you know what I mean? Where you do, and I've talked with many folks, down in this area, and have had, the fortune to visit a few homes down in that area and walk on some of that land, and discuss, and how many, this is generational, right? They've been there for 2, 3, 4 generations, and some of the names, there's folks that walk around down here in Boston, and their names are on some of the roads and things like that, which is pretty neat. Yeah, that's really neat. Yeah.
From that aspect of it. And then when you're talking with some of these people, and they're just so proud of some of the things that are here, and and some of that goes back long before we settled here too. Indian folklore and what the valley meant and the creek meant to the Native Americans down here as hunting grounds, and that's a unique thing in itself that a lot of people don't realize was down here.
Well, and I've noticed as I got to know the place and I've met people there, the pride that people exude from being there and the involvement that they have in the community actually is more prevalent, and they're more open about it than in some of the other towns that I visited. You know what I mean? They just really, there's just a different sense of like, I'm from Boston, and I absolutely love it here, and I'm involved in the community. And I don't know what causes that in certain towns, and certain towns maybe lack it a little bit more, but I saw it right out of the gate when I started meeting people. People were just really willing to talk about the town. They generally love the town's history, and people are a little bit more knowledgeable about it there.
They certainly are, and it runs the gambit. It's not just the I'm using air quotes here, the old timers, but and I don't consider myself that, although I've been here 30 years.
Right.
But even some of the neighbors I have around me today that have moved in the last few years, they just love it, and they just enjoy the community itself, and the friendliness, and it's kind of like an age gone by, right? Where people aren't like that anymore in a lot of communities, and down here, I think they take pride in that.
And they do, and that's what I want to capture with this episode. I want to capture a little bit of the history, and I want to capture where it's going, where it's been, and its place, and the kind of sphere that is developed down in the southern tier. Because Boston and Springville too, I think that was kind of a 1-2 thing for both of them, and both of the towns benefited from having each other, and I still think they do to a larger degree. Is that correct? I mean, you see, like they have this symbiotic relationship with each other.
No, they very much do. And I know about 2 years ago, I was doing a little research on one of the cemeteries here, and was trying to locate it's going to sound a little morbid, where the plots are located, and reached out to Springville and the Historical Society down there, and they had an old map of that cemetery, and it was just interesting to be able to get that, and that partnership, because it was community, and we have a lot of that, especially when you have the Boston, Concord, Springville. You get a lot of that mix in that area there.
Right.
And my dad always said, we're going down to Boston to see Uncle Jake, and Uncle Jake actually lived in Concord, closer to Springville, Dad. Kind of a thing. But it was all one and the same.
Right. So if you had to tell people, just to come on down, and what would the and be after that?
Oh, come on down to Boston and just enjoy the fresh air, the countryside, and don't just drive down the 219 and not stop at a few of the unique shops and get out and walk. We've got some neat parks down here as well. And you get places like, and I'm going to shameless plugs here, Charlap's Ice Cream.
Yep.
You got the home of that down here for that. And that's been a long running business. And get some of these little unique shops. There's an old cider mill in the fall that's down here with 2 big red cider barrels out in the front that I remember as a kid. They're still there, little things like that. And then you get down into the Boston Commons area, if you will, and take a look at that deli. I mean, that deli's got some unique items in it. Not to say that not everybody has unique items, but they've got some nice homemade things, pastries and whatnot that folks can partake in. And then just, again, imagine going back in time 100, 125, 150 years ago and what the area would look like back then, because there are a lot of old homes. And there's certainly plenty of historical markers, and you can pull those up and read a little bit about that past history there, and imagine those days gone by. And then, again, the potential of the future here for the community of Boston, which I think is just really, sky's the limit. And
yeah, I do too. Yeah, I really do. I think that whole area, it was like that first day in Boston and Springville, it really, I don't really know how to impart how it affected me, but it really deeply affected me because I had not really heard anything, and I go there and I see this beautiful Boston Commons that's still there, and the development that's going on near the 219, all these beautiful homes and these newer developments and everything. What the sense that I get in Boston is that things are respected. That's kind of how I feel when I drove through. I saw new development, but in a respectful way, and I saw a respect for the past, and I saw a pride in the area. And the same day, I drive into Springville, and I get the same thing, and I'm like, well, what? People need to see these towns, and they need to know that this is happening here. And one of the things that I'm trying to do with the show is get people to start cross-pollinating. If you live in Olcott, that doesn't mean you can't go down to Boston or Springville. It's not that far, and it's a beautiful drive, right? And vice versa.
Exactly. And if you catch it on the right weekend, if you will, if you're one of those Sunday drivers and make your way out and about, there's always something going on in some of the communities. I know a lot of our fire halls down here do a lot of events.
Right.
Boston is always prides themselves. In the past, they used to do Boston Hill Fest, and we're happy that we're coming out of the COVID times, if you will, and
get right back to it. Sure.
They're looking forward to having their concert series coming back, and it gets hopping down here at times, and again, want a nice setting to enjoy and relax and get away from the day-to-day routine that a lot of us are in.
Awesome.
It's just one of those things. That's my nice 23-mile ride down the 219 is always, it's that decompression from the day. You get home, you got, a little bit of the outside to take advantage of, walk the dog, and just enjoy life.
Yeah, and I hear that over and over and over again from the residents in Boston, whether they've been there their whole life or they've just moved there. That particular word, decompression. I decompress. It unwinds me. I like coming home. I look forward to coming home. And it kind of just underlies the whole experience of being there, and it's what draws people to it. That you are close, but not too close, and you're not, you can get away and still have access to everything. And the community there really is a great community with people who are just good people all around. So
it is. So Tony, I'm going to turn the tables just a little bit and ask you a couple questions. When you came down, did you come off the 219 and
no,
go down
I take back roads. So I came through Orchard Park, down in through George's, down the hill there.
Okay. And the reason I asked that is, I mean, right off the 219, if you were to come down that way, before you know it, you'd miss two historical buildings just at a glance, right? There's right off the bat, as you pass Tim Hortons and the garage that's there, Expressway Automotive, you see Back Barn Antiques. Well, that house is itself a gem. It's been around well over 100 years. There's old photos and postcards of that house, and actually one of the trees in front of it is a witness tree, if you will. For Boston. That's been around for many, many generations.
Right.
And then as you go a little bit further, there's this little white house that comes out a little bit more toward the road.
Okay.
And then the rest of it is on that. Well, that's the old Quaker meeting house from back in the 1800s. And then before you know it, you're into that intersection where CVS and some of the other establishments are down there. But
is there anything to denote the meeting house at all, or is that
not yet? That's on my list as well, right? So there's a lot of we don't want to get too markered out down here, but my God, there is a lot of history down here too.
Well, there is, yeah. Well, there's a ton of history, and that's because of Boston's proximity, though, like you're saying. So that became a place for recreation and for business, and it became a hub. So you're naturally going to have, just a lot happening there. And at that time period, that was laying the foundations for a lot of the stuff that we have now. So yeah, there is a ton of history down there, and it was really worth noting. And I don't even know how I'm going to fit all this into my little episode.
I think it's going to be 2 episodes, and you're going to have to come down again. You and I are going to have to meet, and I'll take you to a few places.
Yeah. Well, even on the first episode, if you could just make an appearance for like 30, 45 seconds, it would maybe we can get us walking somewhere. That would be really nice too. I'd really like that. It would be great to meet you too. This was great, man, and we probably should wrap it up because an hour is about as much as I think people can.
No, I get that with podcasts, but as I stated earlier, there's a lot of history to be found down here, and so much more to be discovered if you do a little digging. And Lord knows, being a history buff and the town historian, I'm still finding unique stories.
Yeah, I honestly could talk to you for the rest of the night about this stuff because I'm fascinated, and that's why, Frank, that's why I do this. I'm the history of this region, and because of its proximity and because of the role it played for a long time, and whether it was shipping or commerce or technology, it's really, and everybody has biases towards where they live, and I understand that, but there's certain areas of the country, and there's certain cities, and there's certain regions that play a bigger role, and we played such a role, and I will continue to in the future. And I think we're starting to rediscover ourselves and rediscover our communities and take a different sense of pride and ownership, right, in this entire region. So, well, that's about it for this episode of the Small Town Western New York Companion Podcast. Thanks for listening, and remember to support the small towns of Western New York in any way you can. They're full of great businesses and people who'd love to see you in their towns. The Small Town Western New York Companion Podcast, the TV series, is a presentation of Discovering Western New York and A.A. Augustine Media Co. and can be found everywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts. Thanks for listening.